Very good evening to you, and a warm welcome to this lecture in the 2017 University of Edinburgh Gifford Lecture Series. I'm Larry Hurtado, Emeritus Professor of New Testament Language, Literature, and Theology in the university, and a member of the Gifford Lectures Committee. And I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Jeffrey Stout, Professor of Religion at Princeton University, as he concludes his series on the theme Religion Unbound, Ideals and Powers, from Cicero to King. This evening, Professor Stout will deliver the final lecture entitled Religion and the Politics of Explanation. And it's now my great pleasure to hand you over to Professor Stout for this final lecture.
Thank you, Larry. Let me once again express my warm thanks to the Gifford Committee for this delightful opportunity. To everyone in Edinburgh who has given me hospitality and attention, and that means especially Anna Conroy, who administers the lectureships with remarkable grace and efficiency. I also want to thank my wife and son for coming, for standing with me. My family for their support, and the same for my remarkable friends who have made this journey with me. It is moving to see the faces of so many friends, old and new, here today. And as I said last night, I would like to know how to make friends well. In my book, Happiness is Fellowship in Virtue. Like Milton, I am as Aristotelian on human flourishing as I am Ciceronian on political freedom. Martin Luther King, Jr., published Why We Can't Wait in 1963. After a half a century, my copy of the book has begun to crumble. Acid is fiber's enemy. The fifth chapter is what King called a polished version of the letter from Birmingham jail, which he drafted while in solitary confinement in 1963. He had been arrested on Good Friday, the day that 8 local clergymen, 7 Christians and 1 Jew, all of them white and proud of being moderates, published a statement deriding the Alabama protests as untimely and the protesters as lawbreakers and extremists. Whoever served King breakfast behind bars slipped him a copy of the newspaper in which that statement appeared. In his open letter to the 8 clergymen, letter from Birmingham jail, King asked poignantly, "Is organized religion too inextricably bound to the status quo to save our nation and the world?" That, in effect, is the epigraph for my series. He went on to express gratitude for the, quote, noble souls who have broken loose from the paralyzing chains of conformity and joined us in the struggle for freedom, unquote. King borrowed the term nonconformity from Emerson. The second chapter of The Strength to Love, entitled Transformed Nonconformist, quotes from Self-Reliance, and it was based on a sermon that King gave repeatedly beginning in 1954. The same passage from Romans that Emerson alludes to in both Self-Reliance and Experience, his 2 pivotal essays, is King's text in those sermons. The letter also draws on the traditions of Black preaching, natural law, and personalist theology, each of which distinguishes ethical from unethical religion on its own terms. And were I to give a comprehensive account of ethical religion, I would have to trace every road that leads to and from Birmingham. I've had to be selective by following a very particular route from Cicero to King. King treats the separation of religion from politics as a heresy that moderate clergy use to excuse inaction in the face of oppression. Their religion becomes, quote unquote, completely otherworldly, he warns, when they invoke, quote, a strange unbiblical distinction between body and soul, between sacred and secular. At a conference in January 1963, King had contrasted religion that, quote, operates only on the vertical plane with religion that also takes ethical responsibility for the horizontal. That speech began by naming domination, exploitation, and humiliation as social ills, and it ended by quoting Romans 12:2, the same passage. Another speaker at the January conference was Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, whom King first befriended on that very occasion. In a blistering critique of racism as a form of idolatry, Heschel argued that the, quote, tragedy begins with the bifurcation of secular and sacred. He said, if we set an example of the right kind, righteousness will break all dikes. Heschel's scholarly writings challenge the idea that prophetic inspiration ended with the biblical prophets. All of the themes I have just highlighted have parallels in the Roman, Christian, and Emersonian sources I have been tracing. Parallels, not, for the most part, common roots. Heschel's Hebrew sources do not employ the concept of religion. Like many Jewish thinkers since Spinoza, he adapted the concept for his own purposes. By rejecting the bifurcation of secular and sacred, he differentiated himself from liberal and Marxist secularists and aligned himself with King. King and Heschel used the term religion to form a political coalition of Christians and Jews. I don't mean, though, that they were the only ones involved. They certainly were not. The same is true of the Birmingham clergyman to whom King responded a few months later. Since Clarkson, religion, and before even, religion has been a coalition builder's term and a fighting word. It does not belong solely to liberal secularists, as you might think if you read John Kennedy's address to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association in 1960. King and Heschel used the term religion to breach the liberal elite's wall between private and public. Like Heschel, Gandhi was a multilingual coalition builder. He borrowed the expression ethical religion from the title of an 1889 book by William McIntyre Salter, which had approvingly described Emerson's approach as, quote, a rhetoric of morals. Salter speaks of exemplarity, the death of faith, the ethical perils of conformity, and the need for transformation. Gandhi paraphrased Salter's book in Gujarati and distributed excerpts widely in India for use in the struggle against British imperialism. In 1917, Salter published a book on Nietzsche in which there are 21 references to Emerson. It has taken the Nietzsche scholarship 99 years to catch up to Salter. Malcolm X, I think I'm ahead of myself here, am I not? There we go. Malcolm X rejected King's Christianity and Gandhi's nonviolence, but retained a distinction between good and bad religion. Malcolm argued that Islam fulfills the need of African Americans for, quote, a religious expression that is not dictated or controlled by their enemies, unquote. A sort of spiritual self-reliance unattainable by conforming to the slave master's Christianity. Be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone, but if someone puts his hand on you, send him to the cemetery. That's a good religion. That's Malcolm X. James Baldwin distinguished between good and bad religion from a point of view akin to Emerson's post-Christianity. The essay Down at the Cross takes as its critical targets the Nation of Islam and the storefront religion of Baldwin's youth. The later essay, To Be Baptized, offers astute portraits of Malcolm X, King, the Black Panthers, and various Hollywood celebrities, and it concludes by imagining what he calls the wrath to come, echoing the ending of the earlier essay, The Fire Next Time. Unethical religion is something King and Baldwin seek to explain. I want now to focus on the mode of critical explanation they have in common with Livy and Emerson. Religion is not, in their view, entirely illusory or inherently oppressive. Piety, awe, and reverence can be properly or improperly directed. They can be cultivated and expressed well or poorly. The effects of the resulting practices and institutions can be good or bad. The bad political effects include tyranny and oppression. Unethical religion, therefore, deserves rigorous critique. Freedom, Baldwin wrote, is hard to bear. It can be objected that I am speaking of political freedom in spiritual terms, but the political institutions of any nation are always menaced and are ultimately controlled by the spiritual state of that nation, unquote. That's Baldwin. The vices manifested in spiritual life help explain the persistence of social ills in need of remedy. In explaining social ills, King adopts a critical point of view. He commits himself to standards of proper valuation. Making use of those standards, he names the ills in evaluative language. They are ills, after all. One of them is racial domination. While he does not define domination precisely, he does wish to correct this ill in all its varieties, not just that one. So he seeks explanations of them. Domination of one or another sort is said to obtain here or there, in part because some people justify it religiously, or their religion excuses them from actively opposing it. The justifications and excuses do not withstand imminent criticism, questioning of the kind Socrates employed when using someone's stated assumptions to undermine their conclusions. Faulty justifications and excuses cannot be explained as an expression of sound reasoning and virtue, the default explanation of human action. How shall we explain such acceptance? A social psychological process for which King uses the pejorative label conformism explains how religion can reinforce domination without necessarily intending to do so. To these Socratic and Emersonian moves, I can now add three more. The first, in the style of Livy, is that the corruption of religious virtue by avarice, power, idolatry, fear, demagoguery, or rivalry can explain particular examples of domination. So that's the first. That's the Livian one. The second, adapted from Cicero, is that paternalist arguments offered in support of hierarchical arrangements merit suspicion whenever the arrangements benefit the dominant group at the expense of those who are dominated. That's the Ciceronian one. The third, owing to Tacitus and Genesis, is that acceptance of oppression by the oppressed has to do with a describable psychodynamics of servility. Now, I've talked about all of those moves in earlier lectures. I won't go further with them right now. But I want to say that King, though he did not work out a theory of religion or an account of the inheritance that I have been delineating, did offer critical explanations of religion, which can be described philosophically and situated historically. That's what I've been doing. How then does this approach compare to the more familiar approaches of Marx, Weber, and Nietzsche, more familiar to academics anyway? Now, the public intellectual who has thought most deeply about this question is here today, Cornel West. He's a tireless defender of King's legacy who tilts valiantly against the most daunting challenges that have been raised against it. In the remainder of this lecture, I want to round off my story by considering a few of those challenges and describing West's responses to them. It is with gratitude for friendship and conversation over more than 4 decades that I hereby dedicate this series of lectures to him. Let me begin by sharpening the contrast between the King Baldwin style of explanation and that of secularists who meet the following conditions. First, they follow Lucretius by dropping the distinction between ethical and unethical religion. That's the first thing they do. Second, they define religion as essentially bad. Third, they seek to limit religion's bad effects, either by restricting it to private life or by trying to extinguish it altogether. And fourth, they build political coalitions unified by agreement on the first 3 points. Ignoring the complications surrounding the early use of the term secularism associated with Comte, I shall now refer to this position simply as secularism and discuss 2 of its Marxist variants, both of which differ from the legacy of ethical religion that West seeks to defend. I should point out that a number of new uses of the term secularism have emerged in the last few years. I'm not talking about those. Charles Taylor's use of that term, Achille Bilgrami's, for example. Like Comte, Tocqueville, Durkheim, and Lincoln, Marx was indebted to classical interest in the integrative and formative functions of religion. We saw that in the earlier tradition, these functions were typically described as ends. That's because they were taken to be mainly products of intentional action on the part of rulers, officials, other powerful people. Now, of course, Marx wanted to see religion fail at performing these functions for commercial republics, and then fail to survive the revolution. Marxist secularism explains the emergence and survival of religious ideas and practices on the assumption that they inevitably have effects beneficial to the dominant economic class. That's at least one important strand in Marx's writings. Marxists have had trouble working out a plausible account of the feedback loops that would explain which ideas and practices predominate by pointing to their effects. Lincoln asked, who benefits from acceptance of pro-slavery theology? Egalitarian freedom movements use such questions to raise suspicion of paternalist ideologies case by case. Marxism takes the additional step of proposing a unified functionalist theory of ideology. Lincoln's Ciceronian suspicion of Dr. Ross aimed to shift the burden of proof in a particular debate by raising the possibility and insinuating the likelihood that slavery's perceived benefits to slaveholders had somehow corrupted slaveholder habits of belief acceptance. A functionalist theory of ideology goes beyond raising such suspicion by offering a general explanation of how the corruption transpires. Even if the feedback loops were fully specified, the generality of the theory would still be a problem. If religion generally or inevitably benefits the dominant class, why is it that religion shows up on both sides of many struggles over domination? West argues that the secularist move is actually a step backwards, empirically and politically. The critique becomes too sweeping to be believed and too elitist and alienating to provide a defensible democratic basis for organizing. He cites Antonio Gramsci as a Marxist who realizes these problems, recognizes them. King and Heschel, West's exemplars of prophetic religion, did not need instruction from Marx to know that religion is often the moral sanction of oppression, the opium of the people, and the sigh of the oppressed creature. Religion, like art, sport, politics, commerce, and academic inquiry, is a set of activities that can go bad. It is also what brought the Diggers to George's Hill, gave Garnett his language of resistance, and inspired Coltrane's Love Supreme. Ethical religion holds that the effects of religion on a society depend on how just that society is and whether the religion being considered is relatively good or relatively bad. In a reasonably just society, virtuous religion would presumably have integrative effects in the short and long term. In a gravely unjust society, virtuous religion would foster self-reliant resistance to tyranny and oppression while performing integrative and formative functions for the friends of justice. Vitiated religion, in contrast, performs the same deleterious social functions for a gravely unjust society that Marxist secularism attributes to religion as such. Marxists suspect that religion often performs its deleterious functions without being consciously manipulated by rulers. Religion performs these functions by sanctifying the established order, by projecting wishes born of this worldly suffering onto an otherworldly beyond, and by shaping individuals into servile subjects who misrecognize their own relation with authority. These explanatory moves ramp up the more modest and ad hoc explanatory moves I have identified in earlier writers. The main difference is that Marxist secularism selects religion as such rather than religion corrupted by vice, as its explanatory target, that is to say, the object of its critical debunking. King explained vitiated religion from an evaluative point of view, which West seeks to state and defend explicitly. From what point of view does Marxist secularism debunk religion as such? The Marxist critic claims that ideology and ideology critique occupy different levels of thought. That all ideologies represent false consciousness, whereas Marxist critique operates at a higher level. It's a higher form of thought. Ideology is used as a pejorative term, and ideology critique is at a different level from it. But what's that higher level, and what makes it higher? One sort of Marxism adopts the so-called objective perspective of natural science. Objectivity is supposed to be what frees the ideology critic from the oppressive illusions in need of explanation. West argues that a non-arbitrary criterion of objectivity has proven as difficult for Marxists to secure as it has for everyone else. But even if someone were able to thread that needle, it is not clear how a perspective modeled on natural science can provide a basis for the evaluative judgments required to identify social ills as ills. An acceptable form of Marxism would have to adopt an explicitly ethical standpoint, West thinks. The oppressed have an interest in overcoming domination. Identifying that interest as a paramount good would presumably be cognitively as well as morally superior to identifying with the interests of the dominant. Of course, the oppressed are not of one mind on what their true interests are, because some of the oppressed are corrupted by servility and prone to hatred and vengeance. We cannot escape the burden of making judgments about true interest and true virtue. For this reason, according to West, no single standpoint is privileged. To adopt a standpoint is to accept its commitments as true, but accepting a commitment as true does not make it true. We are all caught up to some extent in falsehoods and vice, fallibility, and sinfulness. John Dewey's Gifford Lectures are relevant here, the quest for certainty. If there is no single point of view accessible to finite creatures that can grasp the common good with certainty, according to West, there is no substitute for a freewheeling democratic discussion in which each voice, secular and religious, has a say. Marxism's most important contribution to that discussion, as one voice within it, is its claim that economic domination holds a key to explaining such other ills as ideological religion. If there is truth in this claim, the heirs to King's legacy have a stake in figuring out what it is. In Prophesied Deliverance, West argued that some theologians concerned with race had underestimated the importance of class in their analysis of injustice. Race matters, in part, because the culture of white supremacy continues to have effects, including economic effects, which require systemic remedies. It is not coincidental that the global underclass remains largely non-white. Racism needs to be fought, but with other common markers of domination in mind, including empire, gender, sexual orientation, and class. Our critical explanations of tyrannical and oppressive religion need to keep all of these factors in view and to determine, if possible, how they are related. This is why the possible explanatory priority of class domination remains worth considering in West's view. As long as capital generates more power than any movement that seeks to constrain it, it seems likely to constrain what forms of domination are subject to change. King appears to have crashed into these limits when he urged civil rights activists late in his life to think more radically about poverty and militarism, more radically in this sense that they have causal connections to other forms of domination, including the economic. But how those limits should be described and how they might best be breached are questions in need of further inquiry. West calls Nietzsche a brook of fire through which any critic of domination must pass. King is West's chief exemplar of radical democracy motivated by Christian love. Nietzsche's Genealogy depicts both democracy and Christianity as deleterious effects of slavish ressentiment. West places faith in ordinary people to rise above servility and take responsibility for society, at least under the right circumstances. Nietzsche warns that the average person in every people, tribe, or state exhibits the herd mentality, thanks to an innate need to obey, as he puts it. West is morally committed to struggling against domination in all of its forms. Nietzsche remarks that all moralities are effects of a succession of processes of subjugation. Well, if Nietzsche is right about such things, or shall we say entirely right about such things, King's legacy should be rejected. He would almost be the poster child for the two main things being criticized, a commitment to Christian love and a commitment to democracy. A defender of King's legacy could, of course, simply turn that inference on its head by treating King, Heschel, and their prophetic forebears as counter-evidence to Nietzsche's provocative claims. West does defend his exemplars from reductive dismissal, but without implying that Nietzsche's challenge can itself be easily dismissed. Nietzsche's genealogies are slapdash, his generalizations hyperbolic, but the challenge they pose to a defender of democratically oriented ethical religion is to grapple with the truth in them, and there is truth in them. Exemplary human beings and movements are also human, all too human users of power. Biblical verses alternate between yearning for a beloved community and imagining the tables turned on oppressors. Matthew 25 commends care for the least of these, just before imagining sinners burning in hell like a giant prison set on fire. In our time, the herd's vigilant enforcement of conformity turns love into niceness, liberty into license, critique into cant. Ethical religion cannot honestly claim to have escaped these snares entirely. Now consider the pattern of disappointed democratic hopes. Chattel slavery gave way to Jim Crow, which gave way to mass incarceration. The road from Selma leads to Ferguson. Bull Connor's rich Manhattan cousin now sits in the Oval Office, and a coalition of racist and moderate Christians put him there by democratic electoral means. The suspicion that domination is ubiquitous, that it can defeat any foe simply by shifting shape, has empirical support. If domination were inevitable, the only hope for people like Nietzsche would be a triumph for people like him. Now, this conclusion can be held consistently if, like Nietzsche himself, one has no principled objection to domination as such. He regarded being dominated as good for some people and bad for others, including himself, but not evil. Evil is not a word he uses in his own voice. It belongs to slave morality. In contrast, many of Nietzsche's leftist academic followers apply the term domination. They treat domination as both ubiquitous and objectionable as such. They apply the term domination universally to all social systems. They sympathize with currently dominated groups all around the world and recommend resistance to domination in all its myriad forms. In practice, they treat it as evil or wrong. They are uneasy, however, about what their own doing might do. If they won, they would lose, because their values would then become dominant. Proper application of the term domination is still thought to imply that something is amiss, but the grounds for reaching this judgment are no longer evident. As Judith Butler asks when contemplating this problem, why resist? If domination is ubiquitous, mercurial, and unavoidable, why even point it out? The commitment to resistance and belief in domination's ubiquity appear to be in tension. West dispenses with the latter, the belief in domination's ubiquity. But why? He refers in this context to faith and hope, not, however, as arbitrary givens, but rather as rationally permissible practical attitudes. King proclaimed that the arc of history bends toward justice. West does not deny this, but he doesn't forthrightly affirm it. His political hope appears to be more modest than King's, more like Chekhov's or Baldwin's in its horizon and grounds. Bending the arc of history is more responsibility than we can handle. It tempts us to imagine domination as a shape-shifting monster, so powerful that resistance would be pointless. We do well to ask who benefits from that fantasy. West wagers, and I use the word advisedly, that one or another instance of domination is worth fighting against now. Each such wager is defeasible, but needs to be assessed individually in light of goods, evils, evidence, and probabilities. Think of Pascal, William James, and Ernst Bloch. The more catastrophic the evil, the stronger our reason to take risks in the hope of preventing, mitigating, or correcting it, even when the chances of success seem slim. The more pressing a current crisis, the greater our need to act on the basis of present commitments, to place faith in a thought, a relationship, or a project that has earned our assent so far, but that otherwise, were there not a crisis in view, might merit further scrutiny. So long as political action takes place under constraints of time, under conditions of uncertainty, and in the face of great risks and possible benefits, faith and hope will play their parts in it. The curmudgeon may be entitled to his doubts, but let him not discourage the young from making friends well. Desperation we already have in ample supply. The work of justice is to correct our relationships insofar as we can, beginning with the friendships that make further corrections possible. Physicians fighting a pandemic count each life saved as a victory, no matter how grim the big picture and how resistant the bacteria. It should be motivation enough in activism as in medicine to make a difference for the better. Imagine yourself now in a situation that leaves you at the mercy. I should go one more ahead here. The clicker is sticky today. There we go. Now it goes many. Here we go. So that slide will help you see what I just said. Now we're turning to a thought experiment. So imagine yourself in a situation that leaves you at the mercy of a master, a boss, a racial or religious majority, a liberal, radical, or reactionary elite, a public official, a lender, an academic advisor, the local police force, a city's wealthiest developers, or the fortunate 400. You are dominated. But then things change. You acquire the coalitional power to prevent the worst things that your former oppressors might wish to do to you. You are able to negotiate with them, persuade them to attend to your interests, influence and contest their decisions, and otherwise hold them accountable for their actions. Such things happen. You have just imagined yourself in two sorts of concrete power relation. Do you not prefer the second to the first? And why is that? The first, but not the second, leaves you vulnerable to someone's arbitrary power. It makes your welfare dependent on their goodwill. This, in turn, gives you a motive to become a slavish flatterer and to be constantly on the lookout for signs of malevolence or prejudice. In the second sort of power relation, the relation itself can be a good that you and your erstwhile dominators hold in common, an interdependent relation that you and they jointly value and have reason to sustain, a relation that gives rise to obligations that you and they have reason to fulfill. Regardless what the two imagined scenarios have in common, they differ in ways that you care about and should care about. The differences are concrete and need have little to do with the arc of history. The first sort of relation is defective because the tangibly good features of the second are missing from it. The means for moving from the first sort of relation to the second are themselves concrete, familiar, and sometimes available. They include coalition building, campaigns for new legislation, steady vigilance of power holders, wisely exercised counterpower, and practices of accountability and fraternal correction. Domination is not a ubiquitous myth-making, shape-shifting demon that defeats every attempt to slay it and now has an orange face. It is a common relational ill in need of case-by-case diagnosis and remedy. The thought experiment also reveals something about your motives. Wanting to move from the first sort of relation to the second is not the same thing as wanting to turn the tables on someone or wanting to use them. The goal is to secure improved relations or right relations or even friendly relations with others. The desire for well-ordered relations, for a more nearly perfect union of particular individuals or groups, is distinct from envy, pity, and resentment. King spoke of a yearning for a beloved community in which former foes can be reconciled in mutual amity. He had faith that such yearning will someday be wholly fulfilled. West prefers to focus, as I do, on the admittedly imperfect degree to which such yearning has already been fulfilled and can be fulfilled here and now, not least among the friends of justice. If genealogy is defined simply as honest inquiry into the evolution of human values, then the story I am telling about religion aspires to be an example of it. I share the genealogist's goal of exposing the considerable extent to which contingency and arbitrariness have shaped the values we now endorse. But I prefer not to press that explanatory strategy to the point of incoherence. Contingency and arbitrariness cannot be the whole truth about values without undercutting genealogy itself. If the history being recounted were itself merely another expression of contingency and arbitrariness, it would provide no reason for anyone to endorse it or to care about what it says. Like West's genealogy of pragmatism, the account I am offering of ethical religion affirms that some inherited ideals are expressive of rational dissatisfaction with vitiated relationships, oppressive arrangements, and ideals poorly conceived. An honest history of ideals and powers must make room for rational dissatisfaction as a motive of change. An account that does not make such room has no means of explaining the rational acceptability of the evaluative standpoint it adopts. It has no means of explaining the acceptability, the preferability of genealogy as an approach to something. This is a Hegelian point on which Molly Farnath's forthcoming book will shed much light. Las Casas was rationally entitled to his dissatisfaction with the conquistadors. Walker was right to chastise Las Casas for proposing to enslave Africans. King had reason to correct the moderate Birmingham clergyman. Ella Baker's valid objections to King's patriarchal mode of leadership continue to reverberate in the organizing of Black Lives Matter. The worthy ideals we inherit are pearls of great price, the precious residue of struggles born in rational dissatisfaction. To think otherwise is to lose our footing entirely. Figures who have contributed in such ways to our standards of excellence should be accounted for honestly. We need to acknowledge our debts to them while protecting ourselves from mystification and slavishness. Their genuine excellences help explain their exemplary status and why we stand where we do. Their faults help explain why they did not bring ethical, political, rhetorical, or religious striving to a halt. If the admirable dead are faulty, we too should expect to need correction. The process of sorting wheat from chaff will continue. These days we are better at threshing than at baking bread, planting seed, or renewing soil. What Lincoln called the political edifice of liberty and equal rights that was meant to protect people from tyranny and slavery has itself become a massive apparatus of coercion, surveillance, and violence. Our laws are often enforced in a spirit of lawlessness. They have failed to constrain capital's tendency to concentrate power in the hands of a few. They have unleashed bureaucracies, markets, and empires that have thus far defeated all attempts to tame them. The arrangements our ancestors devised as remedies for earlier disorders are now so gravely disordered that we aren't sure what remedies to try next. That is what Livy said when the Roman Republic fell. That is what Machiavelli thought when the Medici retook Florence. That is what Milton wrote when monarchy was restored in England. We are hardly the first generation to experience such loss or uncertainty. Avaricious elites and servile subjects are capable of corrupting institutions which once served a good purpose or a mixed purpose. This is not news. Neither is it a reason to let emerging elites have their way with us or to leave our servile neighbors in oblivion. No hopeful wager, no chance of success. No faith in the transformative capacities of ordinary people, no democracy. Why did our team, department, coalition, movement, or country fail? Well, we say that something went wrong. Mistakes were made. Leadership was lacking. The in-group, having been corrupted by luxury, greed, sloth, and pride, misbehaved. The down and out were poorly organized, ill-informed, resentful, foolish, cowardly, servile, or hopeless. Things went haywire overall because something in particular was flawed, something we can name and perhaps fix. The ills to be explained are named in evaluative language, and our explanations of those ills are evaluative. Such is the homespun language of everyday social explanation. Ethical religions' explanations are like that. They are evaluative from first to last, and mainly woven out of homespun yarns and ancient yearnings. Value-free sociology recasts our explanatory questions. In Economy and Society, Max Weber redefined the vocabulary of social explanation in neutral, probabilistic terms. The intended benefit was a gain in scientific objectivity. The idea was that inquiry conducted in such terms could illuminate human valuing without itself being dependent on contestable subjective value judgments. What business does a professor have professing any value but objectivity? This was the thought. So what do these redefinitions of key terms look like? A dominates B, according to Weber, insofar as B is likely to obey A's orders. Domination, defined in this way, is strictly a matter of probability. It can be measured statistically. To determine whether some relationship exhibits domination in this sense, does not involve judging it according to an ethical standard. All one has to do to apply the term is observe how agents respond to orders, describe their behavior neutrally, and calculate the statistics. The incidence of obedience implies a degree of domination. That's all there is to it. Sometimes we have a practical interest in knowing who is likely to obey whom. Probabilities of obedience merit attention, but obeying orders is often a good thing and sometimes ethically required. Domination in Weber's sense is not in itself a social ill. So an explanation of domination, in his sense, is not an explanation of something we necessarily have reason to remedy or mitigate. Weber was retooling a term Cicero and Milton employed to designate a social ill. But Weber left us without an explanation of that ill. He didn't even inquire into it. He redirected attention to something that his new tool was fitted to investigate. Unless the original ill was addressed in some other way, that topic was being taken off the agenda of social inquiry. Do the same to the other basic terms, and you redirect the agenda of social inquiry away from the explanation of social ills. Weber discusses something called domination, but not the social ill for which an older tradition invented the pejorative label. His sociology of religion draws no distinction between ethical and unethical religion. Weber defines authority, as he defines domination, in value-free probabilistic terms. A person is said to have authority over another just in case the latter recognizes the former's domination as legitimate. Authority is also said to come in three types: charismatic, traditional, and rational. Religions are said to arise as a result of the charismatic authority of a founder and to then undergo a process of routinization, a transition into traditional or rational authority thereafter. Weber's theory of authority is what you get when you take Emerson's value-laden account of exemplary figures, transformative movements, and spiritual ossification, and redefine its notions of domination and authority as value-free probabilities. What hides this fact from most observers, aside from the fact that Emerson is rarely read by students of religion or sociology, is that the account first passed through Nietzsche's hands before it reached Weber. Emerson infused the key terms with the democratic commitments of abolitionism, the movement he was trying to perfect and understand. Nietzsche retained Emerson's rhetorical analysis, but depicted democratic values as the decadent, resentful, secularized residue of Christian slave morality. Well, Weber stood back from that controversy by trying to avoid the questions of who has earned entitlement to someone else's deference, what distinguishes oppressive orders from good ones, and what sort of freedom is worth striving for. His sociology has no way of distinguishing King's charisma from Trump's, and no way of saying why a master's domination of a servile and mystified slave is illegitimate. I find such costs prohibitive. There we go, we went past it. There we are. The criticisms I have just offered of academic sociology cohere with West's criticisms of scientific Marxism. But there is also something West wants to save from Weber's social theory, something Weber adapts from Nietzsche and Marx, something also found in Feuerbach and Du Bois. Weber never defined religion, but he did link it with a human desire for theodicy, for a shared, sustainable way of coping with death, suffering, and funk, if I may allude to the most profound and joyous of the Clintons. The need to console a wounded heart or a devastated community is not waning. No form of political amelioration will erase mortality and sorrow. Hence, religion will not soon disappear. Weber's insight into religion's function as theodicy provider is a reason to doubt his theory of secularization. The latter has to do in part with the increasing dominance of experts, and ironically, Weber's theory is itself cast in the value-free language of expertise. When he echoes Emersonian disenchantment with the iron cage, he does so after hours on the basis of values he regards as privately and arbitrarily chosen. The explanation of social ills cannot do without evaluative language. But, West adds, crucially, the commitments underlying our use of such language need not be arbitrary. Taking responsibility for them in a discussion not limited to the powerful is the best way to earn entitlement to them. Elitism is what Marxist and liberal secularists have in common with the defenders of ossified religion. In each of these ideologies, the standpoint of truly critical thought is equated with the outlook of a privileged class, which is entitled to decide on behalf of others. Sooner or later, the others rebel. The rebellion of the demos is often as nasty as elitists make it out to be. Resentment of neoliberal paternalism begets nativist, theocratic, patriarchal reaction when it doesn't beget genuinely inclusive coalitions of mutual recognition and accountability. If this democratic analysis of elitist paternalism reminds you of John Dewey's, that is not an accident. West and I adapted it from him. One difference is that we find Dewey's pragmatist talk of problem solving too bland a way of integrating value judgments with critical explanation. Not all ills are best described as problems. Some of them are catastrophic or horrendous. Some of them require mourning rather than fixing. The experience of preventable catastrophe disrupts both the liberal politics of lowered stakes and the academic experts' pretense of neutrality. The diction of Las Casas, Savonarola, Winstanley, Milton, Hayrick, and Walker is sublime. Emerson described critical eloquence as, quote unquote, a modulated habit of heat. Now, if some events are catastrophic, if some relationships and arrangements are devastatingly bad for the people affected by them, if some acts by holders of great power are horrific, then something in our midst must be worthy of reverent protection, celebration, and sacrifice. Something is sacred if it is worthy of reverence, awesome if it is worthy of awe, divine if it is worthy of worship. Reverence, awe, and worship are distinguishable religious modalities. Of these, the one most central to egalitarian freedom movements is reverence, the proper object of which is sacred value. Each such movement forms a coalition around shared attributions of sacred value. Theists explain sacred value as grounded in divinity, but egalitarian freedom movements do not generally reach agreement on the nature nor even on the existence of God. King explained sacred value theologically. Baldwin did not. I do not. If we find that the word religion blocks our discussion of reverence, piety, or kindred matters by tying us too closely to Roman and Christian semantic precedents, we can restate our concerns in other words. Meantime, the history of religion talk will be good to know. Running throughout that history, I have argued, is an interest in the contribution of ritual behavior to the ethical formation and deformation of subjects and groups, citizens and cities, persons and peoples. Romans and Christians are not the only ones who share that interest. Religion is not the only word we have for naming it. Another thread running through the history of religion talk is the idea of becoming an example of something for others. The power, importance, and often the price of standing for something and against its opposite before others. Writing a gospel, venerating a saint, emulating a philosopher, initiating a movement, addressing a council, court, a congregation, or an audience in Edinburgh. All of these acts have to do with exemplarity. Standing for something, however fallibly, in the face of catastrophic harm. A cloud of witnesses has conveyed a venerable heritage to us. Insofar as they meant well, they also meant well. They took pains to make their lives legible to an observant eye. By standing for something, they acquired foes as well as friends, and resulting obligations of resistance and conciliation. When new Caesars rule for private gain, or for a faction's sake against the rest, they are tyrants. When they seek and acquire powers that leave others at their mercy, they are oppressors. Is not their due, then, the concerted and courageous opposition of all upright human beings, until the day when our hope for reconciliation on proper terms can be fulfilled? The just have long been called to strip off every encumbrance and rise up. They who have striven with idols and masters have at times prevailed. The past is where the precedents are. The present is where we shall make of them what we will. Thank you very much.
In these 6 Gifford Lectures, Professor Stout has challenged cogently the grand narrative of a great separation in Western cultural history, in which religion was relocated from a previously public influence to a more private and hobbyist sphere, which supposedly enabled Western culture to move in a more liberationist directions, including the emergence of modern democracy, free inquiry, and more egalitarian values. Professor Stout's effective challenge to this narrative has been conducted by an in-depth historical analysis of key figures who serve as case studies of genuinely religious individuals across several centuries, who each criticized then dominant political values and practices precisely on the basis of their religious convictions. To borrow a phrase, these lectures comprise their own inconvenient truth over against the romanticized narrative of secularization that has been so popularly and uncritically echoed. I'm not able to summarize the wealth of these lectures, and they have been rich, and it would be tedious for me to attempt to do so. Nothing could or should substitute from hearing them or hearing them again on the Gifford Lecture's website. And in due course, we hope, reading them in published form. But I'm honored to be asked to give a brief vote of thanks. It is part of Stout's ingenious approach to start with individuals who preceded the Enlightenment, the period of the supposed Great Separation. Stout grants all those whom he discusses their human limitations, as in the case of the 16th century Dominican Bartolomé de las Casas, who, somewhat like the blind man healed by Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, came to his moral vision in stages. But Stout rightly emphasizes that it was their basic religious convictions that helped all those highlighted in his lectures to derive their passionate efforts to oppose injustice and to promote a more generous social and political practice. The time span of the case studies has been impressive, from Cicero to Martin Luther King, whose memorable letter from Birmingham jail was an early influence. And for many of us, I am sure, including me, this was all very informative. Professor Stout's lectures also correct the distortions and unfair relegations to obscurity of some figures. Based on the Tuesday lecture, for example, Emerson may well again be placed in the syllabi of courses on moral and political philosophy. Professor Stout has also demonstrated in himself the union of critical, intellectual inquiry and a personal, even passionate commitment to the stakes involved in our moral and political values and practices. He has shown that a personal involvement can fuel intellectual inquiry and does not inevitably distort its results. His analyses are open fully to others with different commitments, and even to those who glibly profess none. But his lectures demand an equivalent learning and intellectual agility for anyone who would wish to argue otherwise. In a brief interview for these lectures, Professor Stout indicated his personal admiration for the American pragmatist tradition. Now, at least in part, roots of this tradition lie in the Scottish common sense philosophy ascribed to figures such as Thomas Reid and James Beattie, and conveyed to the United States in colonial times by John Witherspoon. Born in Gifford Parish, East Lothian, a graduate of this university in arts and divinity, and an evangelical parish minister who became the 6th president of the College of New Jersey in 1768, the foundation of Princeton University. In addition to major contributions to the college in curriculum and fundraising, Witherspoon also taught moral philosophy, believing strongly that political life must be infused with moral values, and among his students were figures important in the formation of the U.S., including James Madison, Aaron Burr, William Bradford, and Hugh Henry Breckinridge. Indicative of his own commitment to action as well as thought, he was a member of the Continental Congress and its chaplain, the sole clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence, and he helped to draft the Articles of Confederation. Well, in these Edinburgh lectures from a highly respected American scholar, we perhaps hear some reverberation of that early Scottish influence on American political thinking, and also a fresh, powerful, and cogent contribution for our time that comprises an impressive return on that early investment. Please please join me in thanking Professor Stout again.